What's up? It's me, Marty Edtram, the geeky American otaku. I've been doing some other stuff with my life. I've been trying to make more videos, but technical issues keep getting in the way. I'm also not very good at Let's Plays, apparently, or at least playing the games for them. Anyway, I finally have a new video up, and it's a special edition of my main series, The Top 10. Okay, this episode of the Top 10 is something more of a commentary on pop culture history. In this case, the subject is about the top 10 pop culture moments from the year that I think the 1990s really began, 1993. I know you're all thinking, really, Marty? The 90s began in 1990, you dum-dum. Well, technically, yes. They began on January 1st, 1990. But culturally, it still felt like the 80s for the first couple of years. I always feel like there's a period of cultural transition or a bridge between decades when a new one begins. And this is somewhat evident when you watch a movie or TV show from the beginning of a new decade, especially ones from the past. For example, Home Alone came out in 1990, but the fashions and cultural attitudes of the 1980s, they were still prevalent. Also, the movie The Hunt for Red October also came out that year, and it featured the Soviet Union, and of course, it ceased to exist the following year, ending the Cold War, a major touchstone of the 80s. And finally, in 1992, Murphy Brown made fun of then U.S. Vice President Dan Quayle when he lambasted her for being a single mother, even though he couldn't spell potato properly. Well, Danny Boy ended up becoming irrelevant when he and George Bush I were defeated in that year's election, beginning the era of economic prosperity and growth and of unipolar American dominance of the world that are now all pretty much deader than the Macarena. But that's for another day. Anyway, here are my top 10 pop culture moments from 1993. Number 10. The end of Cheers and a new era for must-see TV. On May 20th, 1993, the series finale of Cheers aired, ending its 11-year run on NBC and marking the real end of the 1980s era at the network where Brandon Tartikoff led the Peacock out of its darker days from the late 1970s. When Tartikoff left NBC for Paramount in 1991, he was succeeded by Warren Littlefield. And while NBC stumbled a little bit during that transitionary period, as many of the big hits from the 80s, such as The Cosby Show, The Golden Girls, Night Court, Family Ties, A Different World, and LA Law, either had ended or were ending, NBC would eventually come out on top again by 1994-95, with new hits such as Cheers' spin-off Frasier, Friends, ER, Will and Grace, Just Shoot Me, and a little show about nothing called Seinfeld. Seinfeld initially struggled in its early years, actually. Most people wouldn't know that nowadays, but it would ultimately become one of the most beloved sitcoms of all time. I mean, can you imagine life without Festivus and the Soup Nazi? Number 9. Letterman out, Conan in. Speaking of NBC, in 1992, one of Littlefield's first decisions there was when he controversially chose Jay Leno to succeed the legendary Johnny Carson as the host of The Tonight Show, as opposed to the host of NBC's 12:30 show Late Night, David Letterman. Now this went against both Letterman and Carson's wishes, as Carson saw Letterman as his rightful successor. He never forgave NBC for that, and Letterman, on Carson's advice, was told to go to CBS, which never had a successful competitor to The Tonight Show once his contract at NBC ended the following year. As a result, NBC was forced to find a new host for Late Night, and on the advice of Saturday Night Live creator Lorne Michaels, it chose a writer from The Simpsons named Conan O'Brien. Despite being under a lot of pressure and showing a lot of lack of on-camera experience, Conan eventually got better, and he would go on to become one of the most successful comedians of all time. Of course, he would get screwed over by NBC 16 years later, but that's another story. Number 8. Fox steals the NFL from CBS. Speaking of David Letterman, although his new Late Show beat Leno's Tonight Show in the ratings for about a year and a half, his new home, CBS, would suffer from one of the biggest changes in American TV history. On December 17th of 1993, Fox, which had only been around since 1986, but grew to become popular among younger viewers with hits such as The Simpsons, Married with Children, In Living Color, 90210, The X-Files, Living Single, and Melrose Place, ended up stunning the world by paying the NFL over $1.5 billion for broadcasting rights to the National Football Conference, the NFC, taking that away from CBS, which they had had since 1956, effective the following year. Fox ended up getting most of CBS's NFL crew, including John Madden, Pat Summerall, James Brown, and Terry Bradshaw, to defect to Fox, and an even bigger stunner, convinced several network affiliates across the country, most of which were aligned with CBS and an NFC markets to boot, to switch to Fox, with CBS ending up on lower-powered UHF stations in many of these cities. In fact, this ultimately led to deals between the other networks such as ABC and Scripps and CBS and Westinghouse. The latter two actually ended up merging. When the dust cleared, over 110 stations in over 50 cities ended up changing networks. Needless to say, Fox turned the Big Three into the Big Four, and it changed American television forever. Number 7. Cartoons grow up. The 90s are considered by many to be an animation renaissance in the United States. While there were plenty of great cartoons in the 80s, many of them were made with the intent of selling toys. Now that continued into the 90s to an extent, but as time went on, creator-driven animation started to be embraced by the networks, especially Nickelodeon. In addition, many new cartoons became popular among teens and young adults, even if they weren't the primary target audience. Those shows included Ren and Stimpy, Batman, the animated series, Two Stupid Dogs, Rocko's Modern Life, SWAT Cats, and Animaniacs, and all but the first two debuted in 1993, many of which had jokes and innuendos that went over kids' heads or dealt with topics not usually seen on kids' cartoons, even if they were thinly veiled. In addition, animated shows aimed at adults started to become more mainstream, all thanks to a little show called The Simpsons, which led to a rise in adult animated programs throughout the 90s. Some successful, like Duckman and South Park, some not, like Capital Critters and Family Dog. Speaking of which, number 6. Beavis and Butthead become symbols of Gen X. You said X. Probably one of the most influential adult cartoons of all time, Beavis and Butthead debuted as a full series on MTV in 1993. Originally, it was a short on the network's Liquid Television block. Anyway, the brainchild of Mike Judge, Beavis and Butthead quickly became a runaway hit, running for 7 seasons until 1997, and it has been revived twice. In addition, it had 2 movies. Now, I was only 10 years old back then, and kids my age weren't really supposed to watch Beavis and Butthead. Of course, that didn't stop us from watching it anyway, so Anyway, the 2 are a pair of high schoolers from Texas who are apathetic, sex-crazed, hard rock-loving, metalhead slackers, known for their lowbrow humor and being generally stupid. Or maybe they're actually intelligent and we're the stupid ones. Who knows? I mean, they did provide some insightful commentary while MST3King music videos. Basically, Beavis and Butthead were symbolic of Generation X in that they represented that generation in many ways, as many of the baby boomers before them viewed Gen X as unmotivated, cynical, and unsure of the future at the time. The same could actually be said for millennials and Gen Zers now, which is probably why Paramount Plus brought Beavis and Butthead back for a new generation. Of course, we also know that the show was controversial in several ways, as they were indirectly blamed for the deaths of 2 children when viewers copied what they did in the show. Beavis' pyromania in one case in Ohio, and in the second case, an 18-year-old in New Jersey dropping a bowling ball off an overpass. Of course, in both those cases, neither of the defendants even had cable. But as a safeguard, MTV ended up moving the show to 11 p.m. and added disclaimers telling people who are stupid enough to do what they saw on the show, do not try this at home. Thankfully, the show is no longer subject to censorship thanks to being on streaming exclusively, so we can enjoy the sophisticated intellectual humor of Beavis and Butthead the way it was meant to be. Number 5. Video games grow up and anger Congress in the process. By the time the 90s rolled around, Nintendo's dominance over the home console market was facing its first true threat in the Sega Genesis. Although the Super Nintendo Entertainment System hit shelves in 1991, that year Sega introduced its first game featuring a mascot with speed and attitude that could rival Mario, Sonic the Hedgehog. Sega also advertised the Genesis as a cooler, more grown-up alternative to the supposedly kidified Super NES to teens and young adults. Who could forget their slogan? Genesis does what Nintendo don't. 1993 could be considered the peak of the console wars, and it saw the release of many great titles on both consoles, such as Star Fox, Super Mario All-Stars, Batman Returns, Mega Man X, Aladdin, Tiny Toons, Buster Bust Sleuth and Buster's Hidden Treasure, Sonic Spinball, Gunstar Heroes, Jurassic Park, Mutant League Football, Zombies Ate My Neighbors, NHL 94, and NBA Jam. Of course, people still went to arcades back then, and people fed quarters to the two popular fighting games, Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat. The latter ended up getting an uncensored port on the Genesis. Now this, along with the release of Night Trap and the new ultra-gory shooter on PCs, Doom, caused a moral panic among Guardians, who were already not big fans of video games, and it ultimately ended up drawing the attention of the United States government and resulted in a hearing by Congress, threatening to regulate the industry if they didn't take action themselves. Although Sega had its own rating system called the Video Game Rating Council, it was decided there needed to be an agency for the whole video game industry so other companies would be covered. This resulted in the creation of the Entertainment Software Association and the Entertainment Software Rating Board, or ESRB, ultimately leaving up to the parents to decide what games are best for their kids, as it should be. Of course, if you let your 9-year-old play something like Mortal Kombat or Doom, you're not a very good parent. Number 4. Nickelodeon becomes legendary. For 90s kids like me, Nickelodeon was required viewing. The network had already established itself as the first kids network in the 80s, but it was in the 90s that Nick was in its golden slime age. The decade began with the opening of Nickelodeon Studios in Orlando, which I wish I could have seen in its heyday, and it still had their popular game show Double Dare, which sadly ended production in 1993, along with great shows such as Salute Your Shorts, Nick Arcade, Get the Picture, Nickelodeon Guts, Welcome Freshmen, and the Snick Block on Saturdays, along with the original 3 Nicktoons, Doug, Rugrats, and Ren and Stimpy. But 1993 was when Nickelodeon, in my opinion, became legendary with the launch of their 4th Nicktoon, Rocko's Modern Life, a bizarre show called Wienerville, the sitcom The Adventures of Pete and Pete, which in my opinion was better than most of the crap produced by that pedo Dan Schneider, and of course, a little game show called Legends of the Hidden Temple. God, I really wanted to be on this show when I was a kid. I would have been a green monkey, by the way. In fact, I probably learned about some actual history from this show, and of course, I definitely would have been able to master the Shrine of the Silver Monkey without any problem. As for climbing walls, well, that might be another story. Of course, knowing me, I would have sunk it in the moat and disqualified us. Although the CW brought back the show for adults in 2021, it just wasn't the same. Of course, I wouldn't remind if Legends of the Hidden Temple returned on Nickelodeon or CBS in the future and it was again made for kids. OG host Kirk Fogg could even come back full-time instead of just randomly popping up in the Dark Forest like he did in the reboot. In any case, Legends of the Hidden Temple and Rocko were 2 of the main reasons why Nickelodeon became legendary and was the peak of Nickelodeon's golden slime age. I really hope Nickelodeon can find somebody who can bring back those days for a new generation of kids to experience and not have it be the 24-hour SpongeBob network. Number 3. Mighty Morphin Power Rangers leads to a Japanese TV takeover. It's Morphin time! The show with the original teenagers with attitude fighting evil monsters with karate and megazords first debuted in 1993 and would go on to become both a worldwide phenomenon and a staple of 90s pop culture that endures today. As you can see here, I am a huge Ranger file, and I have been since I was 10. Although I stopped collecting the Megazords when I turned 15, but still, pretty nice collection. I'm also getting my great-nephew into Power Rangers, by the way. But not everyone knew at this time, but Power Rangers helped lead to a Japanese takeover of American TV. Although the show was made in the United States and featured American actors, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers is actually based on the Japanese series Kyoryu Sentai Z-Ranger, which was the 16th season of the long-running Japanese series called Super Sentai, which first debuted in Japan back in 1975, created by the late Shotaro Ishinomori. Believe it or not, there's a whole genre of these shows in Japan called tokusatsu, which are superhero shows with heavy emphasis on costumes and special effects. Power Rangers, of course, was adapted by Israeli-American businessman and TV producer Chaim Saban. Following Power Rangers' success, he brought over and adapted other tokusatsu for American TV, such as VR Troopers and Big Bad Beetleborgs. One non-Saban example was Superhuman Samurai Cyber Squad, made by DiC, which later dubbed my first anime, Sailor Moon. Speaking of, as I said earlier, the success of Power Rangers would eventually pave the way for more Japanese TV shows to take over American TV, even more so than it did in the 80s, and eventually, American kids would get introduced to anime such as Sailor Moon, Dragon Ball Z, Pokemon, and many others, and ultimately anime and other Japanese pop culture is today more mainstream than ever. But as far as I'm concerned, the Japanese TV invasion all began in 1993 with the Power Rangers, and their impact is still felt 30 years later. Oh my god, I am old. Number 2. Jurassic Park makes CGI roar. 1993 was a big year for movies. The Disney Renaissance took a year off as there was no major animated release from the Mouse House that year. The Lion King, which was their next big thing, came in 94. But we'd still have plenty of popular movies come out that year, such as Groundhog Day, Homeward Bound, which I cannot watch without crying, I admit it, The Sandlot, Rookie of the Year, Hocus Pocus, Mrs. Doubtfire, Nightmare Before Christmas, Cool Runnings, and films I wasn't allowed to watch when I was 10, Philadelphia, The Fugitive, Sleepless in Seattle, Indecent Proposal, and Best Picture winner Schindler's List. But the number one film of the year was, what else? Jurassic Park. Based on Michael Crichton's 1990 novel and directed by Steven Spielberg, Jurassic Park features a group of humans on the Central American island Nubar, where genetic scientists clone long-extinct dinosaurs back to life. But when the island's security features and electricity are sabotaged, the humans now need to escape the perilous island before they get turned into dino food. Although computer-generated imagery, or CGI, had been used before Jurassic Park, this movie took it to the next level, with the dinosaurs created from a combination of CGI from George Lucas's company Industrial Light and Magic, and life-size animatronics from Stan Winston, as well as digital surround sound never heard in film before. Jurassic Park would go on to influence the use of CGI to allow filmmakers to realize visions that were once thought to be too expensive or even outright impossible. Jurassic Park would go on to earn more than $900 million at the box office, with 3 Oscars for Best Sound Editing, Sound Mixing, and Visual Effects, and launched a franchise that is still beloved today. And it also inspired a new generation of youths to become paleontologists. Also, because of the groundbreaking use of special effects, Jurassic Park has been added to the Library of Congress's National Film Registry. Eat your heart out, Barney. And number 1, the internet comes home. Well, the internet had been around for a much longer time than most people know. It was actually invented by the Pentagon as early as the 1960s, but by the 1980s, computers became more available and affordable to the general public, and networking became more and more common, if somewhat primitive, though for the most part, the internet was mostly inaccessible to most of the world. That all changed when English computer scientist Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web in 1989 and made it available to the public in 1991. The World Wide Web allowed people to share information, and porn, through the internet using more user-friendly interfaces in order to appeal beyond computer hobbyists. But it was in 1993 when two American software engineers, Mark Andreessen and Eric Bina, debuted the first commercially available multi-platform web browser, Mosaic. Several companies would license Mosaic to create their own browsers, and Andreessen would later go on to create Netscape, which was the dominant web browser for most of the 90s. It would be a couple more years before the impact of the internet would become permanent, leading to its growth that continues today, but the world was able to log in for the first time back in 1993 thanks to Mosaic. Thankfully, we no longer have to hear that annoying-ass dial-up logging on sound. Okay, those are my top 10 pop culture moments from 1993. If you have any moments that you think belong on this list, feel free to leave a comment down below. Be sure to follow me on Instagram and subscribe to my channel. Until then, I'm Marty Yitram, the Geeky American Otaku, and I'm outie, although I have an innie.